Hi guys, so there's a scene in the film Tommyknockers where the Jimmy Smits character stands up at a poetry recital and says something like, "I was hoping to read you something new and angry and daring tonight, but instead I'm going to read you something from my old book." And I kind of feel like I've been doing a similar thing recently on the channel, turning the camera on and beginning with, "Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's talk about another pointless Sudoku sequel." But not today, because I am going to take a little breather from my established review series and talk about a film which has probably stimulated me more emotionally than any other film that I've seen this year. So let's dive in. So the director of this is someone called Jane Schoebrun. You've probably never heard of her because this was actually her debut film as a director, and she also wrote it. She'd done bits and pieces before this, a mini documentary here, a short film there, but this was her first full-length film. She's got a second one out this year called I Saw the TV Glow, and I'll definitely be checking that film out on the strength of this one. Before we go any further, by the way, let me just say that there's not actually a World's Fair in this as such. It's kind of like a metaphor. I interpret the World's Fair in this instance to be adulthood in a global world, but you might describe it differently yourself once you've seen this whole thing. So the storyline involves a young girl called Casey. She leads quite a lonely life. I think she's part of a single parent household, although it's not confirmed. Pretty sure she lives in a very small American town and probably on the outskirts of that town because there's lots of woods near her house. She doesn't seem to interact with that many people. She doesn't seem to have any friends at all. I mean, there's nothing wrong with her to look at her. She seems like a perfectly normal, good-looking girl for her age. I presume she goes to school, but we never actually see any school scenes. But she spends an awful lot of time just in her bedroom on the internet. And it's while she's surfing that she comes across this online challenge. Think Ice Bucket Challenge from years ago, but a lot more dangerous and without any money passing to charity. So this challenge, it basically involves looking at your laptop screen and saying the words, "I'm going to the World's Fair, I'm going to the World's Fair, I'm going to the World's Fair," 3 times like that, then cutting your finger and rubbing a bit of the blood on your laptop screen. And if you do that, you have passed the challenge, but you have also initiated a curse to take place. And what this means is that you will go through changes over the next few weeks and months. But the changes are different for everybody who does the challenge. And in this film, YouTube is full of videos of people who have done the challenge and experienced different changes. And they're not shy about talking about what those changes were. A great many of them seem to do with people's personalities rather than anything physical happening, although there are 1 or 2 exceptions in the videos. But when it comes to Casey, our main character, the changes that happen to her are all with her personality. I mean, this is not a film where a teenage girl starts turning into Brundlefly or anything like that. No, it's more of a psychological thing. It's about the personality. But there are certain questions that you'll ask yourself as we go through the film and observe the changes. So this girl, I would say, is 13 or 14, and she's kind of an age where a teenager would be changing anyway. You know, that's roughly the age that you start developing feelings for the opposite sex or same sex. Your voice starts changing, your emotions are all over the place. You know, you're starting to grow up and move away from being a child. And Casey would seem to me to be somebody right in that wheelhouse at the start of this film. So when her personality starts changing in this, I was sort of thinking, well, is this because of the curse, or is this something that she'd be going through anyway? Another question I asked myself was, are these changes actually happening, or is she just making them up so that she gets to make her own diary type videos on YouTube talking about the changes? Because it seems to me that she's a lonely person wanting to connect with people online, and maybe she wants to be part of the club and talking about how, yeah, changes happened to her after she did the challenge. And there's a third question you might be asking yourself watching this film. So the other main character, there's only 2 principal characters in the whole thing, but the other character is a middle-aged guy who Casey meets on the internet. I'd say he's probably about my age. And it's really inappropriate that this guy is even talking to Casey, really. But he he's one of the very, very few people who actually follows her channel, because it's not a very popular channel. Like, we see some of her videos sometimes and it says like 10 views at the top. But this bloke, he's one of the few people who watches it, and he develops a liking of Casey, and he claims that he's worried about her. He's worried about the changes that are happening to her. He seems to think the curse is real, and what he wants to do is have her permission to sort of observe her over the internet and through her videos, just to keep an eye on her, to make sure that these changes that she's instigated are not going to be fatal to her. So he wants to be the Giles to her Buffy kind of thing. Totally inappropriate. But the question you'll be asking yourself is, okay, is this guy actually just a predator playing the long game, hoping to eventually meet her or something? Or is he actually just somebody who genuinely believes in this online challenge and the curse, and genuinely just wants to keep an eye on this girl for a while just to make sure that she's all right? And, you know, we will frit back and forth between the two possibilities as the film goes on. But in total then, 3 questions really that we'll be asking throughout the film, and that's what impressed me about this, because normally if I find a film where there's just one question I'm asking throughout the story, then I might be impressed, but to have 3 is pretty impressive. So it's quite a simple story. Girl takes a stupid challenge in her bedroom at the start, and then for the rest of it we're just observing her personality changes, mainly as she has this online friendship and she wanders around the house and stuff like that. But at the same time, you've got all these different things that you're having to consider as a viewer, and they are interesting things to keep track of. So it's a simple film, but also a bloody complex one at the same time. The film is very aware that it doesn't have a whole lot of plot to cover its 90 minutes of runtime. So to compensate for this, it works extremely hard, noticeably hard, to stimulate you in all kinds of little subtle ways that you might not always be aware of these things at the time they're happening, but they're definitely there. There's a moment where Casey randomly sings this absolutely bonkers song about mushrooms. You could take it out of the movie and it wouldn't affect the story, but the fact that it's there just really sort of jolts you for a minute. The credits at the start of this, they're in a font that you won't normally see being used for movies, and immediately I started thinking about that, and instinctively at that point I thought this could be quite a clever movie just because of that, and it turned out that I was right. The music in this film, really strong, a lot of acoustic numbers, depressing teenage type of music, but I really enjoyed it, especially the song that opens the movie. I think the whole soundtrack has been done by a guy called Alex G. I've personally never heard of him before watching this, but I looked him up on Wiki, and I get the impression that he's quite a well-known musician, although I wouldn't know because I don't really follow music, but I've listened to 3 or 4 of this guy's songs on YouTube since watching the movie now, and he's really good. I could see myself listening to more of this guy. I think they were lucky to get him for this movie. But this film is directed in such an interesting way. All the camera shots in the different scenes are done very well. I watched this other film on Prime the other night about a couple running away from a grizzly bear or something. It was the most boringly directed film I think I've ever seen. But this film, totally the opposite. There's lots of scenes in Casey's bedroom, and it would have been so easy to just have the camera plonked in the exact same spot, looking out from the laptop screen every single time. But the woman who directs this, she doesn't do that. There's a scene early on where I thought to myself, hang on, we're in a different bedroom here. Has Casey moved house? And we've had like a flash forward type of thing, a time jump, I should say. But no, actually, I think Casey has just moved the laptop to a different point of the room and maybe moved the bed around and swapped a few things around. And this happens several times throughout the film, as far as I can tell. But it's actually quite a believable thing that a teenage girl would move all her stuff around and decide to sit in different parts of the room. But it just gives the film a constantly different look throughout the whole thing, rather than just having that same boring, static camera position. And even when we're outdoors and Casey's just idly wandering around in the brush, we're not doing boring shots where we're right up close in her face. Lots of long shots where she's almost a speck, but we can hear her voice as if we're right next to her. But the fact that we're looking from a distance, it just gives us a chance to look around a bit, have some interesting looking bits of woodland. We're not just up in Casey's face, because we're already spending quite a bit of time up in Casey's face when we're doing the bedroom scenes, if you see what I mean. There's a fantastic bit of horror when she goes to a shed in the middle of the night and she can't sleep, so she decides to watch YouTube on a projector screen, and she's watching some kind of ASMR video. I think that's the right term. It's like a woman whispering and trying to get you to go to sleep, and there's an incredible horror surprise that comes during this scene, which I won't spoil, but it's really effective. There's only 3 or 4 moments of outright horror in the movie throughout this, but when they come, they're genuinely really creepy and scary. But for the most part, this is more of a coming-of-age drama than a horror film, but I still think it deserves to be classed as a horror film. It just so happens that the horror is sort of skirting around on the edges of the film. It's not always in the foreground. If horror was a geographical state of America, this film would be out near the boundary somewhere, but definitely inside the boundary. But the horror that is in this film, it's all real life stuff. Internet horror, growing pain horror, horror of isolation type horror, not really having a family close by all the time. A lot of horror that a lot of people will have experienced in some form or another, as opposed to some really fantastical horror film that's, like Child's Play, very enjoyable, but nothing that's relatable to real life. This film definitely touched my soul in a way, because similar to Casey, I also grew up in a single-parent family. I can vividly remember long evenings being by myself because my dad was out at night school or karate club, as he liked to do. And so I often had to cook my own evening meal for myself at like 13, 14 years old. Or my dad would leave me some money out and I'd go and get takeaway. But those were bleak times, lots of isolation, no one to talk to. And this was back in the 90s, we didn't even have the internet back then. Casey, at least, still has some means for human interaction. But I definitely feel as though attitudes and instincts towards all things online have changed over time, because the internet's been around 20, 25 years now for most people, and everybody's just more clued in to what the possible dangers are. I mean, in this film, when Casey has a falling out with her online friend, one of the first things she does is call him a paedophile, not necessarily because she believes it, but because she knows that'll push his buttons. She knows that he's probably afraid of being accused of that, if you see what I mean. But if this film had come out 20 years earlier, during the earlier days of the internet, it's probable that Casey wouldn't have had a clue as to the dangers of this guy. And we would have been screaming at the screen, just be careful, you've got no idea what this guy could be. But actually in this film, I think she's perfectly aware of what this guy could be, and she's just not fazed, because the way she sees it, he doesn't know where she lives or even her proper name, and she's perfectly safe behind her screen. But even in terms of my own attitudes towards the internet, there was a film that came out 2006 maybe, called Hard Candy, about a girl who goes to stay with a guy. She's only 14, he's like 35. It's totally inappropriate. But I remember watching that film. I didn't know what was going to happen. Spoilers ahead for Hard Candy, by the way. I presumed that the guy in that film was innocent. I thought that was going to be the twist. I thought the girl was going to turn out to be some psychotic teenager. That was my presumption. But fast forward to this film, almost 20 years later, and right from the off, as soon as this male character comes into play, my first instinct was totally the opposite. It was, predator! He's got to be a paedophile! Stay alert around this guy! And is there any difference between the guy in this film and the way the guy was acting in Hard Candy? Probably not, but this is 2024 now. We've got all these horrible stories that we've had in the news for years upon years, and people are just more clued in, and I think people are just more... It's your natural instinct now to just assume that somebody talking to a teenager in a chat room when they shouldn't be is going to be a predator. And so that was interesting for me, just how my attitude as a viewer changed from a film so long ago to a film now. Normally at this point I would show you the version of the film that I'm reviewing, but I don't own this film, but I definitely will in the future. I'm absolutely going to buy this on Blu-ray. Now, I do want to say some words about the ending to this movie, but I'm going to do the bag of terror first, because what I want to say definitely goes into spoiler territory. So if you just want the review and the score, We'll get that all done and dusted, and then you can decide whether you want to hang around for the spoiler or not. So, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 4.5 bloody axes out of 5. I think this is an absolutely masterful film. I really enjoyed it. Very original, very well written, very suspenseful, brilliant main character, brilliant main performance. Hugely impressed by this all round. Right, if you're going right now, cheerio, see you another time. About the spoiler I wanted to go into. So at the end of this film, the final scene is not with Casey, it's with the guy, and he's talking to somebody off camera about Casey, but this is years in the future, and what he's saying is, and I wasn't actually sure what he was saying at first, actually, because he's mumbling a little bit, and I was reaching around to grab my remote to just turn it up a couple of notches, and by the time I did, I'd probably missed a little bit of the dialogue, but I checked out what he said on the wiki page, so I'm pretty up to speed. What he says is that years later, in New York, he met up with Casey, they reconnected, they had a coffee or whatever, got on with each other, and then they went their separate ways again. And supposedly, Casey by this point is a theatre student living in New York. Now, when the guy did this little speech, at first I thought, oh, well, I guess all's well that ends well then. He turned out to be a decent enough bloke after all, I guess. But about 5 minutes later, I thought to myself, you know what? I think he's lying. I don't think this actually happened. I think it's just a fantasy on his part, because Casey's relationship with him is very short-lived. It doesn't last very long. I don't think it means that much to Casey, and I'm pretty sure that a while after they stop speaking, I think she'd even forget about him 3 or 4 months down the line, you know. But on his side, I think he develops a little bit of an obsession with her from watching her sleep on this camera, an unhealthy liking of her, and I don't think he's able to forget her as the years go by. And for some reason, he takes upon it himself to tell somebody about this experience that he had with her back in the day, and I think he's just making up a fantasy in his head about how he met up with her in New York, which is way too idyllic a setting, by the way. I mean, come on. So I just don't think it happens. This meeting that he's on about, I think, as far as we, the audience, are concerned, I don't think we find out anything about Casey beyond the age of 13, 14, and that's fine. Just before the final scene, there's like a flickering... There's like a scene where there's lots of flickering, where Casey's face comes in and out of shot as if the character is fading away from us, the viewer, and we've seen her story in this film, but now she's going to go away and be like a character we find out nothing else about, nothing that's real anyway. And I think that that is possibly also suggestive that this future where she meets this guy in New York, not buying it. But that's my interpretation. You might have a different one. But yeah, great film. Thoroughly enjoyed it. So I'll leave it there for today, and I'll catch you all again another time. Bye-bye.